Hi, I'm Reverend Brian Ferguson. I use the pronouns he, him, his. I realised I didn't introduce myself earlier. Welcome, everyone. It's good to have you here. Now the time for all ages. And this story comes from the Muslim tradition. It's from the religion of Islam. And it's, they're not quite sure geographically where it's from. It might be Turkey, it might be Syria. There's a couple of versions of this song, like all good oral traditions. So I'll make my contribution to the oral tradition. And this is about a character called Mullah Nasruddin, who's a kind of mischievous, part mythical, part real character in much of the Muslim world. And this story has him, he's out working in the fields. And he's been working all day, and it's during Ramadan. And Ramadan is a big holiday in the Muslim tradition where, they basically fast between sunrise and sunset. And so he's out working in the field in the heat, and the only thing he's having is water. He's not eating anything, and he's getting really, really hungry, but he's also getting muddy, and he's getting dirty, and he's getting really, really sweaty. But it's not raining. You notice it's raining today. For those Californians, that's rain. But it's not raining, but he's really hot, and he realizes a big dinner. The wealthiest person in town is actually having everyone over for this feast in the evening after sunset. And he thought he's really looking forward to it, but then he's working hard and he wants to finish the job, and he's running late, and he said, well, rather than go to the feast, go home first and get dressed. I'm going to go straight to the feast. So he goes to the feast, and he's wearing his work clothes, so he's grubby, he's sweaty, he's dirty, and he knocks on the door, and the wealthiest man in town opens the door and sees this person dirty and doesn't recognize him. And he says, well, come on in. He just walks away, doesn't say hello to him, doesn't welcome him, just tells him to come in. So Nasruddin comes in, and he's sitting there, and he can't even get a seat at the table. No one's making room for him. So he kind of squeezes in, but he can't reach any of the food. And none of the staff or none of the waiters are bringing him any food. So he's getting really frustrated. He said, well, I'm going to go home and clean up and come back. I'm not getting any food anyway. I may as well be comfortable. So he goes and he washes and he puts on his clothes and he puts on one of his finest jackets. And he says, I'm going to go back. And so he goes back and he knocks on the door of the wealthiest person. And the host opens the door and says, Nasruddin, we wondered where you were. Come on in. Invites him in. Please have a seat at my table next to me. Bring him food. And everyone brings him this great food, and he's eating it. And so Nasruddin grabs the plate to his food. He puts it in his jacket. He says, eat, coat, eat. And he takes the next one. He puts it in his jacket. Eat, pants, eat. And everyone's kind of looking at him like, what's he doing? What's he doing? He says, well, obviously my clothes are more important than I am, so I'm feeding my clothes because you didn't feed me. I think that's a great example of how we can make so much judgment about people. And as I've said many times before, the only thing we can ever tell by looking at someone is our own prejudices. And so that time, because he was grubby, because he was dirty, he wasn't served, and then he got dressed and he was served. And I think we always have to remember we need to look beyond people, look beyond skin color, gender, sexual orientation, and really see the soul, see the spirit of every person within us.
Now is the time for our reading, and I want to again thank Reverend Brian Ferguson for introducing me to another big, deep, wide thinker, Jeremy Lent. He's the author of The Web of Meaning, the integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. And so I immediately went out and got a copy at our library. Here is our reading for today. Pervasive interconnectedness. Let me say that again. Pervasive interconnectedness is fundamental to the sense of identity that non-Western traditions foster. When members of the Native American Blackfoot tribe meet each other, they don't say, "How are you?" Instead, they ask, "How are the connections?" How are the connections? Similarly, in Central and Southern Africa, a guiding principle for life is Ubuntu, which is frequently translated as, "I am because you are. You are because I am." In many indigenous communities, the type of self-seeking behavior promoted by neoliberalism, would seem to be a form of madness. So back to the first sentence. Pervasive interconnectedness is fundamental to the sense of identity that non-Western traditions foster.
That song was by one of my favourite artists, Peter Gabriel, and Sarah and Oren suggested it, and I was only too keen to have it. I remember when that song first came out, some of you may remember as well, it was during a hard economic time. And the story, and Peter Gabriel wrote the song, he saw this picture of a woman who had committed suicide with a child in her arms, her son in her arms. And then he looked at the hardship that was going around. This was just after the miners' strike in Britain in 1984. And I know our Conscientious Projector movie on Friday night, this past Friday, was showing a movie called Pride, where gay activists had ended up supporting the miners during that time. And I grew up in a mining town. My family was coal mining. And I remember the hardship that went on as the mines closed down. It was devastating. And so many men, their identity was tied up in their jobs. And when they lost jobs, they lost a huge sense of who they were as people. And the line is, moved from it to another town, tried hard to settle down. For every job, so many men no one needs. And then the last line that Sarah finished with, don't give up, because somewhere there's a place where we belong. A place where we belong. And I remember there was that struggle when you don't feel you belong, when you lose your job, when you knew those fundamental parts of our identity. I want to explore today about how does our identity impact belonging to a group. I had a lesson many years ago through an African-American friend of mine around my identity. We were talking, and he was talking about the hardships he experienced growing up in the States, and I was sharing about my experience in growing up. I mean, I grew up in a town with 25% unemployment. That was hard. My parents weren't impacted, but I saw a lot of it around me, my schoolmates, my friends, our neighbours. And I was trying to connect through that hardship. And Chris, my friend, who's African-American, said to me, why are you trying to erase my identity? Why are you trying to erase my identity? I was trying to connect and empathize with him, and he felt I was erasing his identity because I was trying to equate my experience with his. And he was right. My experience is not the black experience here in America. It was hardship, but it was not the same. Because as a white person, I can choose to move in and out my identities. I have the privilege of moving in and out the identities that I choose. And I realize I give a lot of thought, and Chris is still a good friend of mine, and we talk frequently, but I was thinking about that, choosing the identities, and I noticed it was complex. I remember when I lived in London in 1983, there was a lot of discrimination against Scottish people and Irish people. So I emphasised my identity, and then when I came over to the States, where my identity is either benign or welcome, I don't want to play it down, I just want to fit in. And identity is really kind of complex that way, and we have to remember it's up to the person to choose when you want to embrace their identity and not have it imposed upon them. Of course, I've had a complex identity. I remember when I used to be an engineer before I became a minister, and people would always say to me, you don't seem like an engineer. And now that I'm a minister, people say, you don't seem like a minister. And so I always respond to them like, what do I seem like? I'm not sure I want to know the answer. But you can see this kind of worried look in the person's face. I think we've all experienced that, where people are like, you don't seem like this, or you don't seem like someone that goes to church, or you don't seem like someone who's part of an organised religion. You say, I'm not, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. But identity is a complex thing. It's a complex thing. And I invite you to reflect which part of your identities perhaps you have to hide or suppress to be part of a group, perhaps even to be part of this group. Perhaps your Christian identity you don't feel completely comfortable sharing. Perhaps there's other identities that you haven't shared. But sometimes to be part or to really feel we belong, we have to kind of suppress or give up part of identities. And that is so sad, that's so heartbreaking. And that was why I loved the meditation for Victoria Safford saying, no, it's not that you are just welcome here. Whatever your identity, you are part of this religious community. It's not that you're welcome, because that again pushes people to a distance and a separation. You're welcome here, whatever you bring your whole self here. You know, and identities can be challenging. We think of the challenge that the feminist movement had with many black women who did not identify with the feminism of the time because their identity first and foremost was black, and then they were women. And that created a lot of tension with white feminists, work that's still being worked through right now. In the reading earlier that Jeanne shared with Jeremy Lent, this is another quote from him that I find particularly powerful. He says, "Our values arise from our identity. If someone defines themselves as an isolated individual, they will feel entitled to pursue their own happiness at the expense of others. Someone who identifies primarily with their nation will have no qualms about putting up barriers to prevent others from entering. And if you identify primarily with all life, you're likely to devote your existence to work for the benefit of all sentient beings. Our mainstream culture, forged in medieval Europe and rationalized by reductionist science from the 17th century onward, tells us to find our identity in separation. But that old worldview of separation has expired. It's not just dangerous, it's leading us to the precipice of ecological devastation and climate breakdown. It's plain wrong." Those are the words of British author Jeremy Lent. I think one of the keys for us moving forward is one of the keys for us to really build a spiritual religious community is to prioritize our spiritual identity. Prioritize our spiritual identity beyond consumerism, beyond our job, beyond the role of parenting, family member. Prioritize our spiritual identity and placing that at the center of who we are. Because if we do that, then we're emphasizing the values, the ideals, and our highest aspirations. So what do I mean by spiritual identity? I think spiritual identity emphasizes that mental aspect of life as opposed to the material, and seeks to discover the essence of who we are, what's important to us, and what do we commit ourselves to. Commit ourselves to humanist ideals such as love, compassion, patience, resilience, forgiveness, contentment, responsibility, harmony, and concern for one another. Ideas, values, and ideals beyond a purely materialistic view of the world, without necessarily accepting belief in a supernatural God or a divine being. And the Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa talks about belonging in community, the spirit of Ubuntu that Jeanne mentioned earlier in her reading. It says that Africans have a thing called Ubuntu. It's about the essence of being human. It's part of the gift that Africa gives to the world. It embraces hospitality, caring for others, being willing to go that extra mile for the sake of another. We believe that a person is a person through other people, that my humanity is caught up, bound inextricably with yours. When I dehumanize you, I inexorably dehumanize myself. The solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. Therefore, you seek to work for the common good because your humanity comes into its own in community and belonging. Those are the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And that makes sense to me because I look how I've been formed through my relationships with family, through my relationships with friends. And I think we all are formed. We are forming each other through this religious community and through the many relationships we have. And I know the symbols of give us more belonging, and this stole gives me a greater sense of belonging in this Unitarian Universalist community because it was given to me in my installation in May 1st. And Cindy Williamson made this stole, and many of us asked what were these symbols, because some people were a little suspicious it might be a Christian cross. And so I asked Cindy, and here's the answer. She goes, they're supposed to represent questions. I feel like I've heard from you in your sermons of what do we bring to each other? What do we bring to Redwood City? What do we bring to the world? And the answer is more. More love, more hope, more justice. I love that. More love, more hope, more justice. When we start striving towards that, that is us placing our spiritual identity at the center of who we are. The spiritual identity of ourselves as individuals and the spiritual identity of us as a religious community. And I think our community will be strengthened, our sense of belonging will be strengthened if we place a spiritual identity at the center of who we are. And that is aspirational, it's difficult. We all have the day-to-day struggles in life, getting food on the table, doing your job, trying to get your kids out of school in the morning. I see some nods of agreement there. But can we put our spiritual identity, our values, our ideals, our principles at the center of who we are and aspire to them? Because I think if we can put a spiritual identity, we'll transcend gender, race, class, and I think that could be really powerful because there is a need to do that. Because we can even transcend the political differences if we can connect as spiritual beings. And the Reverend Scott Taylor, the Unitarian Universalist minister, says the true gift of belonging is not that you get to come inside the circle. It's that you participate in expanding it. That's life's promise. As the circle grows, so do you. And I think a healthy religious community has this ever-expanding sense of the word we. When we say we mean something larger than what it was yesterday. When we say we tomorrow, it's something larger than what it is today. And there's this great idea coming from the Buddhist tradition, and it's a paradox. It says that a true spiritual being should have a strong back and a soft front. A strong back and a soft front. And the idea is you do need to be grounded in what gives you strength and meaning, but you need to be open to change. That soft front where we absorb the culture, we absorb the ideas, we absorb the encounter with difference, and we grow from it. Because ultimately, I think a spiritual identity is this ever-going quest for transformation. And there's a wonderful parable from the Sufi tradition, and it's called the parable of the stream, and this stream of water runs, and it's running down the mountain, running through forests, and eventually it hits the desert. And when it hits the desert, it goes over the sand, and it just sinks into the sand. And it keeps doing, and the stream thinks, I cannot go any further. I'm hitting the desert, what can I do? And the wind's blowing and says, why don't you join me? I travel across the desert all the time. It says, I can't do that. You're the wind, I'm a stream. And the wind says, well, what about if you evaporate and I will carry you across the desert, and at the other side I can drop you as rain. And I love that idea, and the stream's thinking of it and says, but then I won't be a stream anymore. I will be the wind. He goes, no, you will be water. And I love that idea that sometimes when we hit barriers in life, sometimes when we hit struggles in life, we do need that transformation. We need to change. We need to be supported by something else. And in the case of the parable, it's the wind. But we do not lose the essence. Even when the stream evaporates, it's still water. And when it drops at the other side, it forms another stream. It's back to water. And it changes, but it retains its essence. And I think as healthy spiritual life, we're going to have those changes. We're going to have those struggles, the deaths, the health scares, the mental health scares, the losses, the broken relationships. Can we transform? Can we adjust? Because I think ultimately the Spirit is malleable. That allows us to deal with these things and still continue to journey through life. Because ultimately our spiritual life is not about truth, but growth. And it's not really about health, it's about healing, and it's not about being, but it's about becoming. And I don't think a religious life, a spiritual identity is about knowledge, it's about finding inspiration and hope. We are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing towards it. The process is yet to finish, but it's continuing on. And the spiritual life, the spiritual identity is not the end, but it's about the journey. Can we grow in a sense of belonging, grow our community to widen the circle of those who are included and to help others belong in this community? And can we bring more goodness, beauty, and love into the world? That's what my spiritual identity, I hope, will allow, and I invite you to join me in this journey.